Hi, and welcome to this brief presentation about the representative and robust monitoring guidelines for NRMs, and specifically in this presentation about achieving representativeness with our monitoring. My name is Jules Fennell, and I'm the Merry and Planning Coordinator at NQ Dry Tropics. This presentation will complement the guidelines that are available on the NRM Regions Queensland website in the SWIF Resources section. I would recommend having the guidelines with you as we work through the presentation, and we'll be concentrating on what is covered in pages 7 to 18. This is a short presentation that will focus on achieving representativeness with our monitoring. I'd just like to quickly note at this point that this presentation and the guidelines are about biophysical monitoring, and that is changes in the physical environment. While the principles of representativeness and robustness are also important in social monitoring, we're not going to cover them here. So why does achieving representative monitoring matter? There's four main reasons. When we apply for and we get an NRM project, we're stating to the funder that we're going to deliver a particular outcome, and monitoring is the way that we're able to demonstrate that we achieved that outcome. NRM organisations are science-based organisations in that science informs what we do, such as the interventions we apply to create change in the landscape. And while our monitoring doesn't need to reach that of the standard needed for research, it still needs to be based on scientific principles. When we create a change in the landscape, we want to understand what happened and to learn from this what has worked and what makes an intervention effective, but also what didn't work. So monitoring gives us the data to be able to understand what happened. Also, the majority of our projects are funded through government programs, and that is they are funded by the taxpayer. So we need to be able to show what benefit was achieved for the investment made, and monitoring enables us to do this with credibility. A way to sum this up is that we want our monitoring data to be sufficiently credible, so we're confident in its reliability and that it would stand up to a scrutiny by others. So in this presentation, we'll be focusing on one half of the equation, and that is representativeness. The other half of that equation is robustness. Now, what do we mean by representativeness? Basically, it's how well the monitoring you did reflects the actual condition of an asset or a landscape. By asset, we mean something like an endangered ecological community or a particular species. We also need to ensure that our monitoring accurately reflects any changes to that asset or landscape that occurred because of your project. The key thing to understand is that when we monitor, we are usually only sampling a very small area, and we're using this data to extrapolate or infer that what happened at our monitoring plots is what happened across the whole area. So, as an example, if we're doing VegCats to monitor the condition of a 150 hectare area of native vegetation, we would use 6 monitoring plots. Each monitoring plot is 500 square metres or 0.05 hectares. So 6 VegCat plots equals 0.3 hectares. This means that out of a 150 hectare site, we are monitoring less than half a hectare, and we're using that data to say what's going on across that whole 150 hectare area. So getting it right matters. To achieve representativeness in our monitoring, we need to consider 4 things: accurate mapping, stratification, placement of monitoring plots, and a monitoring schedule. And we're going to look at each of these in turn next. Firstly, looking at accurate mapping, we want to map as accurately as we can when we're setting up our project polygons. This means only representing the exact areas of change and excluding areas that won't change. So using the example that's on the screen, this is a grazing property where we'll be looking to change the condition of part of the property through improving grazing land management. If you look at the map, there are areas that are obviously not going to change, including wetlands, a homestead and a yard, and a fenced off irrigated area. For our mapping to be accurate, we need to make sure we're excluding these areas because they won't change because of what we're doing, and we're not going to be monitoring them for the change. Once we've mapped our areas and created our polygons for a project, we need to account for the variation that is present within them. So depending on the area and what you're doing, there are different types of variation that you'll need to look for and take into account. So this could include things like vegetation types, like regional ecosystems. It could include grazing land types, current conditions at the site, such as a burnt area and an unburnt area, and the interventions that you're going to be applying across the site. So in the example on the screen, Although the project site is one area, you can see that there's two different regional ecosystems, or REs, REA and REB, and that the site has been stratified or divided based on these. You can also see that the vegetation is at different stages of growth. So there's some mature growth, some regrowth and some revegetation. And the site's been stratified to take this into account too. So this one site has now been stratified into 4 assessment units or stratification units. In terms of where we place our monitoring plots, we want to make sure they're in areas that are a good representation of the site and not in areas that aren't a good representation of the site. So in the example that you can see on the screen, the blue outline represents our polygon, and we've already excluded the 2 dams, which we've outlined in yellow, because we want to map accurately, and obviously these areas won't change. So we can see on the map, there's obvious tracks from both cattle and vehicles, and in the bottom left, there's a congregation point for cattle. So these areas would not be good for monitoring plots, as they're not the same as most of the site. Some monitoring methodologies include specifications for areas to avoid, such as besides roads or fences, and others don't. But either way, it's something for you to be aware of and take into account when positioning your monitoring plots. I'd just like to take a moment here to clarify that when we're monitoring for change, we're not looking for the areas with the most change and using those to represent the site, or in other words, cherry picking the best data. This would obviously not be an accurate representation of what had occurred over the whole site, and it would misrepresent what we'd achieved. The last of our elements for representativeness is a monitoring schedule. So as we know, monitoring isn't just spatial, it takes place over time, and the duration is usually dictated by the length of the project. So when we're planning out our project and our monitoring, we need to be mindful of when we're going to monitor. And we need to make sure that our monitoring is done at the right time so we're able to make valid comparisons. So if, for example, we measured ground cover in a grazing area at the end of the dry season and then at the end of the wet season, this would not be a valid comparison because we're not comparing like with like. The difference in ground cover at the end of the wet season would be much greater than at the end of the dry season, but this isn't necessarily because of anything we'd done, but because it rained. If, however, we measured ground cover at the end of the dry season and then again at the end of the next dry season, that would be a valid comparison because they were done under the same conditions. So in the graph on the right, you can see the pale blue areas represent seasonal rainfall and the orange arrows are the monitoring schedule. So monitoring is done in the dry season and it's been done as close to a year apart as possible within the project timeline. We also need to make sure that we're doing our baseline monitoring before we undertake any on-ground activities that's going to alter the condition. So there you have it, a quick overview of what is needed to achieve representativeness in our monitoring. Now, while it might seem like a lot of work to get this right, being able to demonstrate what your project achieved with credible data is a vital part of good project delivery, as well as making sure you get more projects in the future. So if you get the right processes and procedures in place, this will become second nature. This presentation is focused on representativeness, which of course is only one half of the equation, with the other half being robustness. Robustness is covered in the guidelines in pages 19 to 34, and there's a similar presentation to this one on the NRM Regions Queensland website if you want to look at that. So thank you for watching this presentation and happy monitoring.